The sea crashes endlessly against the jagged cliffs of Scotland, its roar masking cries that no villager ever heard. Imagine a cave hidden by the tide, stretching a mile into the earth, a place where light itself feared to linger. From this cavern, a family of 48 emerged under moonless skies, hunting not animals, but people. For 25 years, they devoured over 1,000 unsuspecting travelers. Tonight, we unseal the legend of Sawney Bean, the most feared cannibal Scotland ever knew. And before we descend into this abyss of blood and secrecy, hit subscribe now, because what waits in the shadows will haunt you long after the video ends. Alexander Sawney Bean was not born into power nor cursed with noble blood. He was a drifter, a man who turned away from honest labor and found refuge with a woman just as cruel as he was. Banished from villages for their crimes, the couple retreated to the coast, where jagged rocks and pounding waves concealed the entrance to their new kingdom of night. The cave itself was monstrous, cavern after cavern, branching deep beneath the cliffs with chambers vast enough to house livestock, or in this case, human prey. Salt air mixed with the stench of smoke, rotting flesh, and stagnant seawater. Here, the couple laid the foundations of a dynasty that would one day number nearly 50 souls. Children were born in the dark, raised not on milk and bread, but on human flesh. Grandchildren followed, never knowing daylight, never touching grass, never seeing the sun. For them, the taste of blood was not horror, it was tradition. At first, the killings were clumsy. Sawney and his wife ambushed travelers at night, striking from the cliffs or blocking lonely roads. The victims' screams were swallowed by the waves, their bodies dragged back into the cave. Limbs were severed, blood drained, and meat hung from hooks like butchered hogs. Nothing was wasted, not even bones, which were cracked open for marrow. As the children grew, the killings became an industry. Raiding parties moved with ruthless precision. Men ambushed women, searched for valuables. Children carried the grisly spoils home. The cave became both larder and graveyard, its walls lined with salted flesh and piles of gnawed bones. Travelers disappeared by the dozens. Entire families vanished after straying onto the wrong road. Villages whispered of witches, of demons, of ghosts haunting the cliffs. No one dared imagine the truth that their neighbors' missing kin were hanging in strips from a cannibal clan's ceiling. Yet the Beans thrived in secrecy. Jewelry, coins, and clothes were hidden deep within the cave, piled into grotesque heaps of stolen wealth. By daylight, the family slept in darkness. By night, they hunted again. They had no fear of discovery until one evening a single ambush went horribly wrong. A young couple, newly married, rode along the coastal road. Sawney's children struck, dragging the bride from her horse. But the groom fought with desperate fury, sword flashing in the moonlight. For once, the clan faltered. Villagers passing by heard the screams and rushed to help. The Beans fled into the night, leaving behind undeniable proof that something monstrous had been stalking Scotland for decades. The survivors' testimony spread like wildfire. Word reached King James VI himself. Outrage turned to action. Soldiers, bloodhounds, and villagers marched together toward the sea, determined to end the nightmare. Torches lit the night as the hunters closed in on the hidden cave, unaware of the hell that waited within. The soldiers stood before the cave mouth, the tide hissing at their boots as if warning them to turn back. The air smelled of rot carried by the sea breeze, so pungent that even hardened men gagged. Dogs snarled and pulled on their leashes, desperate to plunge into the darkness. The order was given, torches raised, swords drawn, and they entered the abyss. The first chamber seemed ordinary, a cavern carved by centuries of waves. But as the men pressed deeper, the flickering firelight revealed something that froze them in place. Human limbs salted and stacked like firewood. Arms dangling from ropes. Feet tossed in piles like discarded shoes. The soldiers who had faced war found themselves trembling before this silent charnel house. Further in, they found makeshift tables blackened with dried blood. Tools, knives, cleavers, saws were laid neatly as if in a butcher's shop. Bones cracked open for marrow littered the ground, some still gnawed to splinters. One soldier vomited where he stood. Another crossed himself so feverishly that his torch nearly fell. Deeper still, the stench thickened until it was nearly suffocating. In a side chamber, barrels of salted flesh sat sealed, waiting for future feasts. On the walls hung jewelry, dresses, and cloaks stolen from the dead, grotesquely arranged like trophies. Every item represented a life taken, a soul swallowed by this underground empire. Then came the most chilling discovery: children. Dozens of them, their eyes shining with animal hunger, their lips slick with red. Born into this nightmare, they hissed at the soldiers like feral beasts. Behind them lurked Sonny Bean himself, a towering figure with wild hair and a beard matted by blood. His wife at his side, her face twisted with venomous defiance. The soldiers did not fight with swords at first, they fought with disbelief. This was no army, no rebellion, no foreign invader. This was a family. Men, women, children, all united by the same ritual of flesh. It was not madness to them. It was life. And they had been living it generation after generation undisturbed for over 2 decades. When the order was finally shouted, chaos erupted. Soldiers surged forward, dogs snapping, children shrieking. The Beans fought savagely, biting and clawing, their nails sharp from years of tearing flesh. But the royal troops outnumbered and overpowered them. One by one, the cannibals were dragged into the light, screaming like creatures blinded by the sun. Outside, villagers gathered as the captured clan was hauled out. The crowd gasped, some fainting, others crying out in recognition. There were clothes and trinkets taken from their missing kin clutched in the Beans' filthy hands. The truth was undeniable. The missing were not lost to storms, nor to bandits, nor to witches. They had been eaten. As the family of 48 stood bound and snarling in the daylight, the soldiers debated whether such evil deserved a trial at all. Witnesses demanded immediate justice. Mothers who had lost sons hurled curses. Fathers who had lost daughters demanded fire and sword. This was not just a crime. It was an open wound carved into the heart of Scotland. The decision came swiftly. Sonny Bean, his wife, and their entire bloodline of cannibals would be executed without trial. It would be both punishment and cleansing, a warning to any who might dare to follow such a path again. But even in chains, the Beans did not beg. They spat, they laughed, they promised vengeance from beyond the grave. They were marched under heavy guard toward the nearest stronghold, torches hissing in the salty air as the tide receded behind them. Shackles clanked in a grim rhythm, the line of prisoners shambling like a broken centipede across the heather. Along the road, silence fell wherever the procession passed. Even sheep gathered on the hillsides seemed to watch motionless, as if the land itself held its breath for judgment. Rumor outran the column. By the time they reached the fortified town, a crowd had swelled along the gates, fishermen with nets still damp, mothers clutching children, close old men whose eyes had seen wars, but never this. The stench of the cave clung to the prisoners, a sour salt and smoke reek that made people step back as if the smell alone could stain the soul. Yet no one left. They had to see the faces of the ones who had unmade their world. In a dim hall where wind rattled the shutters, an officer read the royal decree with a voice like hammered iron. There would be no formal trial. The atrocities, the trophies, the meat salted and stored, these were judgment enough. A murmur rolled through the room, not relief, but a harsher thing, the crowd's fierce agreement that some evils forfeited the right to arguments and pleas. Sonny listened without blinking, his wife's mouth curving into a smile that made even soldiers shift their weight. That night, a priest was led to the cells requested by townsfolk who still believed the condemned should be offered a final mercy. He found the clan in a darkness so thick it felt woven eyes reflecting his lantern with animal brightness. The priest spoke softly of forgiveness and last confessions, but his words touched nothing in them. A daughter of the clan tilted her head, almost curious, and asked if his god had ever tasted hunger like theirs. The lantern flame stuttered. The priest's hands shook as he blessed them anyway. Dawn came, raw and wet, sky the color of lead. Carpentry echoed in the square timbers, raised stakes hammered iron made ready. The clan was brought out one by one, their feet dragging furrows in the mud. No jeers met them now, only a stunned quiet. Grief and rage had burned down to a harder ember. In the front row stood those who had recognized a ribbon, a ring, a cloak from the cave. They held each other like shipwreck survivors clinging to driftwood. The punishment began with Sawney and the grown men of his brood. The method was pitiless, meant to mirror the slow cruelty the family had visited on others, but officials refused to let it become a spectacle. Orders cracked like lashes, no triumph, no sport, only sentence. The square tightened into a breathless circle. Even the gulls wheeling overhead fell silent, as if a stern wind had stilled their cries. Sawney stared past everyone as the first blow fell, as though looking at a horizon only he could see. He neither pleaded nor cursed. He bared his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. His wife watched, unshaken her gaze, a nailed door that would not open. Children of the clan huddled together, not weeping but muttering in a private language of shrugs and side glances, as if this too were part of a season that would pass. When the women and younger ones were led forward for their own sentences, the crowd swayed. Some turned away, others wept. A few reached for prayer without realizing their hands had moved. The priest whispered quickly, voice hoarse blessing as many as he could, as if scattering seed ahead of a storm. A girl no older than 12 fixed him with a steady stare and asked whether the road beyond the sky had caves. He could not answer. The final moments were oddly quiet. No drum, no trumpet, only the wash of wind and the creak of ropes. Justice, once declared, moved like a tide, steady, cold, inevitable. When it was done, the square seemed larger than before, emptied of something heavy, yet ringed by an absence that hummed. People did not cheer. They drifted home in twos and threes, speaking softly, carrying their silence like a newborn they were not sure how to hold. That evening, the sea breathed in and out beneath the cliffs, indifferent and eternal. Soldiers sealed the cave with rock and fire, choking its tunnels with smoke until the last ember died. But legends do not extinguish so easily. Fishermen swore some nights the tide pulled wrong near the headland, as if water avoided what it could not cleanse. On the road, travelers still felt eyes on their backs after sunset, and in cottages across the coast, parents began to tell a new caution. Do not stray from the path, do not follow strange lights, and if the wind smells of smoke and salt at the same time, run. In the years that followed, the tale of Sawney Bean was passed from hearth to hearth, flickering in firelight like a ghost that refused to rest. Some told it as warning, others as entertainment, yet always with the same shiver at its core. Children grew up hearing that the world could hide monsters not in castles or forests, but in caves just beyond the fields they knew. Ballads and broadsheets carried the story far beyond Scotland. Merchants repeated it in London taverns, sailors whispered it on foreign docks, and soldiers returning from war recited it to silence. Barracks filled with laughter. Each retelling bent the tale, stretching numbers, sharpening horrors. But the essence remained a clan of men and women who ate their neighbors alive. Historians argued whether such a family could have existed as legend described. Some claimed the numbers were impossible, that 1,000 victims would have emptied whole counties. Others insisted that desperate times breed desperate acts, and the Black Douglas Wars had left scars deep enough to make beasts of men. Skeptics called it propaganda, meant to paint Scotland as barbaric. Believers swore bones had been found in those caves, gnawed to splinters by human teeth. But whether true in every detail or not, the story lived because it carried something larger than fact. It carried fear. It was the embodiment of what happens when hunger mates with cruelty, when exile turns to vengeance, when the family bond twists into a pact of blood. To tell of Sawney Bean was to remind oneself how thin the line between civilization and savagery truly was. The cave itself remained a sight of dread. Fishermen avoided the headland, steering their boats wide even when seas were calm. Travelers on the coastal road left offerings, bread, coins, scraps of cloth as if to appease spirits still hungry beneath the rock. On stormy nights, lanterns were said to glow faintly inside the cliff, though no one dared approach to see whether they were torches or something else. Local courts used the name Sawney as a curse, a shorthand for lawless cruelty. A thief who mutilated his victims was called a bean. Mothers hushed crying infants with threats that Sawney's brood would come if they did not sleep. In this way, the clan continued to feast not on flesh, but on memory sustained by every repetition of their name. Generations passed, yet the legend refused to die. Writers inked it into pamphlets, turning the beans into characters both grotesque and strangely compelling. Playwrights put them on stage audiences gasping at the sight of painted blood and stage caves. The more society tried to make them fiction, the more the story rooted itself as a possibility too dreadful to dismiss. Visitors came in secret, guided by locals who charged coins for the risk of leading strangers to the sealed mouth of the cavern. Standing before that wall of stone, people whispered prayers. Some laughed nervously, others pressed their palms flat against the rock as if listening for breath on the other side. None lingered long. Scholars collecting folk tales noted that the Sawney story often grew darker with each telling. In some versions, the clan numbered over 100. In others, they were sorcerers who called storms. A few said Sawney's spirit still roamed, teaching others the craft of feeding on flesh. It was as if each generation needed to make the tale more grotesque to keep it alive. And yet, beneath the exaggerations, one thing remained constant: the recognition that the true horror lay not in demons or curses, but in people themselves. Sawney Bean was no phantom, no beast from folklore. He was a man, and so was every son, every daughter who followed him into the dark. That was the detail that turned stomachs that made villagers glance at their neighbors with new suspicion. The Beans were human, and that more than anything was the nightmare. As the 18th century dawned, travelers still spoke of Sawney Bean in hushed tones, their stories drifting like fog from village to village. In lonely inns, men swore they had seen shadows moving near the cliffside long after the family was gone. Women crossing the moors at dusk clutched their cloaks tighter, convinced that the rustle in the heather was not the wind but the echo of bare feet padding toward them. Folklorists began to record the tale with growing fascination. They described the Bean clan not just as criminals, but as a kind of inverted society, a kingdom of night where marriage was incest, children were born only to inherit the hunger, and law was nothing but the sharp edge of a knife. The cave, they argued, was less a home than a mirror of human corruption, a cathedral where cruelty replaced prayer. For some, the story became a tool of control. Parents invoked Sawney's name to frighten children away from wandering priests, warned congregations that straying from God's light meant falling into Bean's darkness, and rulers quietly encouraged the legend to remind subjects that without order and crown, chaos would devour them. Sawney Bean had become more than a man, he was now a lesson wrapped in horror. Sailors carried the tale abroad, telling of Scotland's cannibal king to wide-eyed listeners in Dutch ports, French taverns, and Spanish markets. Everywhere it traveled, it was reshaped, sometimes becoming a pirate clan that feasted at sea, sometimes a mountain tribe who stalked the Alps. Yet always the core remained a family of flesh-eaters hidden and breeding in the dark. Some claimed the Bean's spirit infected others. Reports emerged of travelers gone missing near entirely different coasts, their remains discovered gnawed and butchered. Locals whispered Sawney's brood spreads. Whether coincidence, copycats, or invention, it only deepened the conviction that cannibalism was not confined to one cave, but a hunger waiting in every shadow. In the 19th century, penny dreadfuls revived the Beans in lurid detail, filling cheap paper with scenes of gore that made readers both nauseous and unable to turn away. Artists sketched grotesque depictions of the family Sawney with teeth like a wolf, his wife with eyes like burning coals, their children crawling like insects on human bones. Fiction gave the legend new life, and with it a permanence that even truth could not erase. Tourists began to visit Ayrshire, some demanding to be shown the cave despite warnings. Guides led them to the cliffs, pointing out where the entrance had once gaped like a wound in the rock. On stormy nights, waves foamed and crashed, making the cliff tremble, as if the sea itself remembered what had been hidden there. Few dared linger. Most returned to their lodgings, pale and silent, the sound of water still roaring in their ears. Psychologists of the early 20th century dissected the tale, calling it a parable of repression exile and the monstrous potential of isolation. They suggested that perhaps the beans never existed at all, but were instead a collective nightmare, a story Scotland told itself about the dangers of turning away from community. And yet for every skeptic with pen in hand, there were fishermen swearing that bones still washed ashore, carried out from the cavern's depths. During the wars, soldiers retold the story in trenches, their voices low as shells thundered above. To them, Sawney Bean was proof that men needed no bombs or bullets to become monsters, that hunger and cruelty alone could turn families into predators. One soldier wrote in his diary, "When the shells stop, I wonder if we too will crawl into caves breeding only violence." The story served as both warning and mirror, showing men themselves. By the mid-20th century, Sawney Bean had become cemented as Scotland's darkest legend. His name appeared in horror anthologies, radio programs, and even carnival shows, where actors in masks with dripping beaks or blood-stained rags reenacted the ambushes of travelers. Children screamed, adults laughed uneasily. But beneath the theater, there was always the uneasy truth, whether legend or history. Sawney Bean spoke of something real within us, the hunger that, if unchained, makes us devour one another. As the modern age crept in, scholars asked not whether Sawney Bean had lived, but why his story had survived. They pointed out that countless killers had been forgotten, yet Sawney endured for centuries. The answer, they argued, was that his tale touched a primal nerve, fear of the family itself, turning predator of the hearth, becoming the butcher's block. Writers began to see the Beans not merely as monsters, but as symbols of what happens when humanity is stripped away. In the darkness of their cave, family bonds were not about love or protection, but about survival at any cost. The clan was a grotesque parody of society, showing how loyalty without morality becomes the seed of horror. Communities around Ayrshire held on to the legend like a scar that could not heal. Even in the 21st century, locals would lower their voices when speaking of the cave. Some avoided walking the cliffs at night, claiming the air turned foul and heavy there, as if memory itself clung to the stone. A few even said they had heard wailing when the tide was high, a chorus of voices trapped forever under the waves. The tourist trade picked up on this fear. Bus tours stopped near the coast guides, spinning tales as visitors peered into the mist. Some companies sold lantern walks, inviting the curious to stand where the soldiers once did and imagine torches flickering against walls strung with human flesh. Selfies were taken, jokes were made, but few laughed once darkness fully set in. Teachers debated whether to tell the story in classrooms. Was it history or folklore? Morality tale or propaganda? Yet students leaned forward, wide-eyed, eager to hear every detail. The power of Sawney Bean was undeniable, even if not every word was true. The fear it sparked was as real as the cliff wind cutting through their coats. Film and television soon seized on the story. Cannibal clans on screen bore Sawney's shadow, from horror movies set in American backwoods to thrillers about isolated families who lived beyond the law. Every time an audience gasped, somewhere in the echo lingered the original Scottish nightmare, still whispering across centuries. And yet, for all the spectacle, the human heart of the story remained its most disturbing element. Sawney was not a demon nor a mythic beast. He was a man who chose cruelty when he could not bear labor, a man who made murder into livelihood and passed that choice on to his children. His wife was no passive victim, but an architect of atrocity. Together they proved that monstrosity does not need horns or claws, only hunger and opportunity. Historians who doubted the scale of the legend admitted one chilling truth. Cannibalism did exist in times of famine and war. Families had turned on each other. Neighbors had slaughtered neighbors when hunger gnawed deep enough. The Bean clan, whether entirely real or not, was a concentrated reflection of what starvation could awaken in the human soul. Thus, the story endures not because of certainty, but because of possibility. If even a fragment of it could be true, if even one family had lived in a cave raising children on the flesh of strangers, then the tale demands to be remembered. It is less about what was, and more about what could be if darkness is left unchecked. So the question is not whether Sawney Bean lived, but whether Sawney Bean could live again. The cave is sealed, the family long gone, yet the hunger he represents is eternal. As long as there are shadows, as long as isolation festers and cruelty whispers, the story of Sawney Bean will return, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters are not those we invent, but those we allow ourselves to become. Today, the legend of Sawney Bean is woven into Scotland's cultural fabric like a dark thread that refuses to fade. His name appears in tourist brochures, ghost tours, and horror anthologies. Yet, for locals, it is less a tale of entertainment than a memory of warning, a reminder whispered across centuries that evil can hide in the most ordinary of men. Visitors who stand at the sealed cliffside report an unsettling quiet, as though the waves crash softer there. Some claim the air feels heavier and that gulls avoid circling directly overhead. Guides sometimes extinguish their lanterns for a moment of silence, and in that blackness, tourists swear they hear the faint shuffle of bare feet echoing deep in the stone. Modern psychologists interpret the Sawney Bean story as a kind of cultural scar tissue formed around collective fears of famine, lawlessness, and exile. It is, they argue, less about one family and more about the dread of what happens when society collapses. The cave becomes the symbol of a world where rules no longer bind, where hunger dictates morality, and where the family the unit meant to nurture becomes the cradle of horror. The tale also exposes the paradox of fascination. People recoil from the images of salted flesh and butchered limbs, yet cannot stop telling the story. Horror entertains even as it repels, and perhaps that is why Sawney Bean has never been forgotten. He embodies our fear of the abyss, but also our temptation to stare into it. Folklorists note that the clan's legend is not unique, but echoes stories across cultures. Tales of families who turn inward, who consume others to survive or dominate. From Greek myths of Kronos devouring his children to tribal warnings of man-eating demons, Sawney's brood belongs to a lineage of narratives that remind us how fragile the boundary between man and monster truly is. Yet the Scottish legend is distinct because it feels so human. There are no gods, no curses, no supernatural excuses, only choice. Sawney Bean and his wife chose cruelty over labor, chose hunger for flesh over hunger for bread, and then taught their children that murder was not crime, but inheritance. That choice, stripped of magic or myth, makes the story linger with a sharper edge. To this day, some skeptics argue that Sawney Bean never existed, that his story was an invention of propaganda, a tool to frighten or control. But even they cannot deny the power of the legend, fiction or truth. It has shaped imagination, stirred fear, and held its place in history far longer than many real kings or battles. Because in the end, the Sawney Bean story is not only about the past, it is about us. It asks, when stripped of comfort, when cast out from society, when pressed by hunger and rage, what would we become? Would we remain human? Or would we too carve a cave into the dark and feed upon the world that abandoned us? That is why parents still tell the story at night, why tourists still seek the cliff, why scholars still argue in print. The legend refuses to rest because the question refuses to rest. Sawney Bean lives as long as we fear the worst in ourselves, and so the waves crash on the Ayrshire cliffs, eternal and indifferent. The cave is sealed, but memory is not. Somewhere in the minds of those who listen, the clan still lurks wild-eyed, blood-slick, waiting in the dark. Their story closes with no neat ending, only an echo, beware the shadows, for in them Sawney Bean still waits.